Elijah Warwick was 42 years old, and until that Tuesday evening, he believed his 12-year marriage was the one thing in his life built to last. He was a structural engineer, the kind of man who designed buildings other people trusted with their lives, and he had poured that same quiet precision into everything he gave Renee. His seed money launched her interior design firm. His professional contacts built her client list. His silence absorbed her contempt for years, while she drained nearly $40,000 from their joint account and transferred a commercial property to her mother for a single dollar. Renee had spent 3 years constructing the perfect exit: hidden accounts, a ghost LLC, a divorce attorney on retainer before Elijah ever saw a single paper. She believed she knew exactly who she was dealing with: a quiet man, an overlooked man, a man who would walk away with nothing and be grateful for the mercy of it. She leaned in at the divorce hearing and whispered, "You'll never touch my money again." She had no idea the judge was already opening the envelope, and what was inside it would change everything. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Through the morning haze, cranes pierced the skyline like metal fingers reaching for clouds. Elijah Warwick guided his car through downtown traffic, his mind already mapping the day ahead at the construction site. At 42, he'd spent 2 decades putting his engineering stamp on buildings across the city. Invisible contributions that would outlast him. The radio hummed low, playing old soul music. Elijah adjusted his rearview mirror, catching sight of his own reflection. Dark eyes, tired but focused, like always. The gold wedding band on his left hand caught the early light. 12 years of marriage to Renee, and sometimes he still felt like he was trying to read a blueprint with half the pages missing. Last night's conversation replayed in his head. Renee talking about her interior design firm's latest project, a luxury condo development. "I landed the Harrison account," she'd said, not mentioning how Elijah's recommendation had opened that door. She never did. The same way she never mentioned the startup capital he'd provided 6 years ago, or the nights he'd spent helping her draft business proposals. Traffic slowed to a crawl. Elijah watched a construction crew setting up for the day, their movements precise and coordinated. He appreciated that kind of efficiency, the way each person knew their role, how the whole operation depended on trust and clear communication, things his marriage seemed to lack more with each passing month. The morning sun climbed higher as Elijah pulled into the job site parking lot. He checked his phone, 3 emails from contractors, one from Renee about a dinner party she'd planned without consulting him. "I invited the Morgans," her message read. Not, "We should invite," or, "What do you think about having?" Just another decision made, another fact presented. The day passed in a blur of inspections and meetings. At 2:30, his project manager called to cancel their 4 o'clock review. "Supplier issues," Mike explained. "Need to reschedule for tomorrow." Elijah sat in his car, considering his options. He could stay and get ahead on paperwork, or head home early, something he rarely did. The house would be empty. Renee never returned before 7 these days, always with some explanation about client meetings or supplier consultations. The drive home felt different in afternoon light. Their neighborhood, all manicured lawns and tasteful facades, looked like something from one of Renee's design magazines. Their 4-bedroom house stood back from the street, its architecture traditional but elegant. Another thing Renee had chosen, though they'd paid for it together. Inside, the house held that particular stillness of empty spaces. Elijah loosened his tie, heading to his home office. The room was the one space that remained purely his, though lately he'd noticed Renee rearranging things during her cleaning frenzies, subtle shifts that felt like small erasures. He had receipts to file from the Anderson project. Opening the bottom drawer of his desk, he reached for the folder marked Current Projects. His hand brushed against something unexpected. A manila envelope, thick with contents, addressed to Renee from Davidson, Wells and Associates, attorneys at law. The envelope was unsealed, its contents slightly askew, as if frequently handled. Elijah's fingers felt numb as he drew out the papers. The first page bore a header he'd seen before. In commercials and bus stop advertisements, petition for dissolution of marriage. The date stopped his breath. 11 months ago. Before their anniversary dinner at Le Bernardin. Before the Christmas trip to Jamaica. Before all those morning coffees he'd made while she checked her phone in another room. Renee's handwriting covered the margins. Neat annotations in her precise script. Notes about accounts he'd never heard of. Questions about property division. Comments about establishing separate residence. And maintaining professional reputation. With hands that didn't shake. He noticed this with a kind of detached surprise. Elijah took out his phone. He photographed each page methodically, making sure the images were clear and complete. 47 pages in total. When the last photo was taken, he returned the papers to the envelope, aligning them exactly as he'd found them. He placed it back in the drawer, precisely where it had been. The drawer closed with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silent house. Elijah sat in his office chair, hands flat on his desk. He did not move. The afternoon light shifted across the room as minutes stretched into an hour. 47 minutes passed in complete stillness, marked only by the steady tick of the wall clock Renee had chosen for his office last Christmas. Through the window, he could see their neighbor's sprinkler system activating, water arcing across a perfect lawn. A normal Tuesday afternoon in a normal suburb, while inside this office, 12 years of marriage revealed themselves as something entirely different from what he'd believed. When the front door opened at 7:30, Elijah didn't turn from the television. ESPN played highlights from a game he hadn't watched, but he could recite every play if she asked. Renee's heels clicked across the hardwood, a sound he'd heard thousands of times before, but now it carried the weight of performance, like an actor hitting her mark. "You're home early," she said, setting her designer bag on the kitchen counter. The same bag he'd given her for their anniversary 3 months ago, not knowing she'd already drafted their ending. Meeting got cancelled. His voice came out normal, steady. He'd spent 47 minutes learning how to make it sound that way. Renee moved through their kitchen with practiced grace, pouring herself a glass of the white wine they kept chilled. She hadn't asked if he wanted any. She never did anymore. "The Harrison project is going to be bigger than we thought," she said, settling into the armchair adjacent to his couch. "Linda wants to expand the scope to include the building's common areas." "We," he noted. She still used "we" when talking about successes. The same Linda Harrison he'd introduced her to at a building commission dinner 2 years ago. The connection he'd cultivated over a decade of professional relationships, handed to Renee like a gift she now claimed she'd discovered herself. "That's good news," he said, watching her face. The slight lift of her chin when she talked about work. The practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. Had she always been this transparent? Or was he only seeing it now through the lens of 47 photographed pages? "I'll probably be working late all week," she continued. "The preliminary designs need to be perfect." She took another sip of wine, her wedding ring catching the light. "Don't wait up for me, okay?" He nodded, letting her fill the silence with more details about her day. Each word felt like another brick in a wall she'd been building between them, thinking he couldn't see it rising. She talked about client meetings, supplier issues, a lunch with her mother Gloria, the same mother who'd never quite hidden her belief that her daughter had married beneath her potential. At 10:15, Renee announced she was heading to bed. She kissed his cheek, a gesture so practiced it felt mechanical. "Don't stay up too late," she said, like she always did. Like nothing had changed. Like she hadn't already planned exactly how their marriage would end. Elijah waited 30 minutes after hearing their bedroom door close. He grabbed his keys silently, stepped out into the night air, and drove exactly 2 blocks away. The neighborhood was quiet, streets lined with dark houses where other people's marriages might or might not be what they seemed. He parked under a streetlight and pulled out his phone. Calvin's number was still in his recent calls. They'd spoken last week about meeting for lunch, plans that hadn't materialized. Now that casual lunch would become something else entirely. Calvin answered on the second ring. "Hey, man, it's kind of late." "I need your help," Elijah said quietly. "Professional help, the kind you can't talk about." The line went silent for a moment. Calvin Okafor had been his friend since college, both of them understanding early that they had to work twice as hard for half the credit. Now Calvin was one of the city's most respected forensic accountants. He knew what a late-night call like this meant. "Tell me," Calvin said. Elijah laid it out clinically: the envelope, the divorce petition, the financial details in Renee's annotations that didn't match what he knew about their accounts. He didn't mention the 47 minutes he'd sat motionless in his office. Some things even old friends didn't need to know. "I can run some preliminary searches," Calvin said. "Business registrations, property records, that kind of thing. Give me a few days." Those few days stretched like rubber bands about to snap. Elijah went to work. He made coffee in the mornings. He listened to Renee's stories about the Harrison project. He performed normalcy with the same precision he brought to engineering calculations. Calvin's call came on Friday afternoon. Elijah stepped away from a job site to answer it. "You need to see this," Calvin said without preamble. "Your wife's firm, it's been restructured. There's a secondary LLC formed 18 months ago. Your name isn't on it. None of your original investment is acknowledged in the new structure." Elijah stared at the crane swinging overhead, tracking its arc against the sky. "Send me everything." That evening, parked in the same spot 2 blocks from his house, Elijah reviewed Calvin's findings on his phone. Business registration documents, corporate structure charts, filing dates, each piece a carefully planned step in Renee's exit strategy. He opened his Notes app and created a new document. At the top, he typed, "What she thinks, I don't know." The cursor blinked steadily as he began his list, each entry precise as a blueprint measurement. He wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. This was about documentation, about foundation work. The first entry read, "Secondary LLC, formation date 18 months ago. Deliberate exclusion of original investment." Chapter 2. The Geometry of a Quiet Man's Anger. Scene 2. Attorney Diane Pittman's office had no decorations, just clean lines and organized files. She sat behind a heavy oak desk, hands folded, listening as Elijah methodically laid out his evidence. The photos of the divorce petition, Calvin's preliminary findings about the LLC, the discrepancies in Renee's financial statements. Diane didn't nod sympathetically or make comforting sounds. Her face remained neutral, professional, absorbing each detail like she was building a blueprint in her mind. When Elijah finished speaking, she was quiet for exactly 12 seconds. "Here's what you need to understand," she said, her voice precise as a scalpel. "Right now, you have suspicions backed by preliminary evidence. What you need is documentation that can't be explained away. Bank records, transfer histories, property documents. Every single move she's made needs to be traced, verified, and presented in a way that leaves no room for alternative explanations." She pulled out a legal pad and began writing. "This will take months. During that time, you cannot, and I mean cannot, give her any indication that you know. One slip, one confrontation, one moment of justified anger, and she'll start covering tracks. Do you understand what I'm asking?" "Yes," Elijah said simply. "You'll need to live normally, be the husband she expects you to be. While we build the case, you're going to carry knowledge that will burn in your chest every single day. Can you do that?" "Yes." Diane studied his face, measuring his composure. "Most people say yes, then crack in week 3. But I think you might actually mean it." She slid the legal pad across her desk. This is what we need. Every item, every document, every connection. Nothing moves forward until we have it all. Over the next 8 months, Elijah and Calvin constructed their case with architectural precision. They worked nights, weekends, early mornings, times when Renee was occupied with her own secrets. The evidence mounted steadily. 3 hidden accounts emerged from the financial archaeology. One in Renee's maiden name, opened 6 months after the LLC restructuring. Another under a business subsidiary she'd created solely to hold assets. A third, jointly managed with her mother Gloria, showing regular transfers that coincided with major client payments to the firm. The commercial property transfer was their cleanest evidence, a clear fraudulent conveyance designed to move assets before divorce filing. Gloria Beaumont's signature on documents transferring a $430,000 property for $1, dated exactly 2 months after Renee's first consultation with her divorce attorney. Calvin traced $40,000 in cash withdrawals from their joint account over 3 years. Small amounts, never enough to trigger attention, but forming a steady stream when graphed across time. Each withdrawal documented, each date noted, each pattern established. Through it all, Elijah came home every night. He asked about Renee's day. He maintained the rhythms of their marriage while watching her perform her own role, never suspecting that he was documenting every lie, every omission, every calculated move. On a bright Sunday morning in March, Renee served him the divorce papers. She'd chosen her moment carefully, after breakfast, before he usually left for his weekend site inspections. She wore a cream-colored blouse that probably cost more than his first car. "I hope we can do this without making it ugly," she said, her voice practiced and smooth. The same voice she used with difficult clients. "I hope so too," he replied, accepting the papers with steady hands. The night before the hearing, Elijah sat in Aunt Dorothy's living room, the same room where he'd done homework as a child, where he'd told her about meeting Renee, where he'd processed his mother's death 5 years ago. Dorothy watched him with clear eyes that missed nothing. "Make sure what you do lasts," she said simply, and he understood exactly what she meant. At the courthouse, Elijah placed the sealed envelope on the table with careful precision. Renee sat across from him, elegant in a navy suit, still certain of her victory. Her attorney, expensive, confident, completely unprepared, objected immediately to the introduction of new materials. Diane Pittman calmly noted that the envelope had been properly submitted through Discovery channels 3 weeks prior. Their office had signed for it. The documentation was in order. Renee leaned across the narrow space between them, her whisper sharp and vicious. "You'll never touch my money again." The judge opened the envelope. The room held its breath as she began reading from Calvin's 73-page forensic report. Pages of bank records, property transfers, timeline analysis, documentation that couldn't be explained away. Renee's attorney's pen stopped moving. In the gallery, Gloria Beaumont's face drained of color as her name appeared in the record, attached to specific dates and dollar amounts. The judge looked up, her expression grave. Given the evidence before this court suggesting deliberate and sustained financial concealment, all joint assets are hereby frozen pending full investigation. She continued the hearing, setting a new date for complete review. Elijah walked out into the afternoon light. He didn't smile. He didn't look back at Renee or Gloria. He simply exhaled, releasing 8 months of perfect performance in a single breath. The conference room at Diane Pittman's law office felt smaller with 5 people crowded around the table. Elijah sat between Diane and Calvin, watching as 2 court-appointed forensic accountants spread documents across the polished surface. Paper trails had a way of telling stories, and this one was just beginning to speak. "We've been granted full access to the firm's records," the senior accountant explained, her voice matter of fact. "That includes client contracts, payment histories, and all corporate communications from the past 7 years. Diane nodded, her expression unchanged. And the secondary LLC? Complete transparency required there as well. Any attempt to restrict access will trigger immediate sanctions. Elijah watched silently as Calvin leaned forward, spreading his own carefully organized files. For 8 months, they'd worked with partial information, whatever they could legally access without tipping their hand. Now, with court authority behind them, every drawer was being pulled open. Calvin's methodical review had already flagged something. Elijah could tell by the way his friend's shoulders tensed slightly as he compared documents. After 20 minutes of cross-referencing, Calvin looked up. "The Morrison Chase contract," he said quietly. "That was the turning point for her firm, wasn't it?" Elijah nodded. 4 years ago, major commercial development project. Full interior design package for their new headquarters and satellite offices. Right. Calvin slid a glossy magazine across the table. "You might want to read this." It was a regional business publication, the kind that celebrated local success stories. Renee's photo dominated the cover. She looked polished, confident, every inch the self-made entrepreneur. The headline read, "Design and Determination: How Renee Warwick Built a $1 million brand." Elijah had never seen it. He hadn't even known about the interview. The article was 4 pages long, filled with professional photographs and carefully crafted quotes. His eyes caught on one particular passage. The breakthrough came when Morrison Chase selected her firm for their expansion project. "I knew this was the moment," Warwick explains. "I'd been cultivating relationships in the commercial sector, waiting for the right opportunity. When they chose us, it validated everything I'd been building toward." Elijah set the magazine down very carefully. The Morrison Chase contract had come through Marcus Morrison himself, a man Elijah had worked with on 3 major engineering projects over a decade. When Marcus mentioned needing an interior design firm, Elijah had recommended Renee's company. He'd made the introduction personally. He'd vouched for her capabilities with his own professional reputation. She had never mentioned him once in the article. "There's more," Calvin said quietly. After Morrison Chase, she landed 6 other major commercial contracts within 18 months. All of them cited the Morrison project as a key factor in their decision. The firm's revenue increased by 340% in that period. Diane was already writing. "This is textbook unjust enrichment," she said, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had just found a load-bearing wall. She didn't just hide assets, she built her entire business success on professional relationships you cultivated, then deliberately concealed your role to maintain sole control of the profits. The court-appointed accountants exchanged glances. This wasn't just about hidden bank accounts anymore. This was about the fundamental story of how Renee's success had been achieved. Later that evening, Elijah stood in Aunt Dorothy's living room, facing his assembled family. His sister Marina, his older brother James, Dorothy herself, the people who had known him longest, who had watched him build his life brick by careful brick. He told them everything: the divorce petition, the hidden accounts, the property transfer to Gloria, the Morrison Chase contract, the magazine article. He presented each fact without emotion, the way he would explain structural specifications to a client. The silence when he finished was absolute. Then Marina burst out, her voice shaking with rage. "That calculating bit!" "Marina," Elijah said quietly. James was already on his feet. "I'm going to talk to her. Right now. She needs to—" "No," Elijah cut in, his voice firm but gentle. "You're not going to do anything. The process is working exactly as it should. But she," Marina started again, "is facing consequences through proper channels," Elijah finished. "Every document is being reviewed. Every account is being traced. Every claim she made is being examined. That's what needs to happen." His composure seemed to steady them, though anger still radiated from both siblings. Dorothy watched from her armchair, her eyes sharp and approving. She understood what Elijah had already learned. True power didn't need to shout. "The courts will handle this," he said simply. "Our job is to let them." The room slowly settled, though tension still hummed in the air. His family wanted to fight for him, to defend him, to make noise. He was asking them to trust in something quieter but far more permanent. The methodical dismantling of every lie Renee had built her success upon. The legal notice arrived at Gloria Beaumont's house on a Tuesday morning. Standard certified mail, requiring her signature. She stood in her foyer, elegant reading glasses perched on her nose, as her perfectly manicured fingers began to tremble. Notice of motion to void. Fraudulent conveyance and join additional party in the matter of Warwick Furter. Warwick. Within an hour, her calls to Renee started. First to her cell phone, then to her office, then back to her cell. The carefully maintained composure that had carried Gloria through 12 years of polite disdain for her son-in-law was cracking. In Diane Pittman's office, Calvin walked through the timeline with clinical precision. His laptop screen displayed a chronological chart, each date highlighted and cross-referenced. 14 months ago, Calvin explained, pointing to the property transfer documentation. The commercial property at 1842 Marshall Street was transferred from Renee Warwick to Gloria Beaumont for a recorded sum of $1. The timing is significant. Diane made notes in her precise handwriting. "Show me why." 2 months prior to this transfer, Renee began consulting with her divorce attorney. "We have the initial consultation payment records." Calvin moved his finger up the timeline. The property's assessed value at the time of transfer was $875,000. No reasonable person would sell a commercial property for $1, unless they were trying to remove it from the marital estate before filing for divorce, Diane finished. Elijah sat quietly, watching the evidence accumulate. The property had been purchased with joint funds during the marriage. Its rental income had been part of their shared financial planning. Until it wasn't. "Gloria's signature is on every transfer document," Calvin continued, "date-stamped and notarized. She knew exactly what she was doing." Diane's motion was 43 pages long, supported by exhibits that traced every step of the fraudulent conveyance. The law was clear. Transfers made to avoid division of marital property could be voided by the court. 3 days after the notice was served, Elijah encountered Gloria at Preston's Market. He hadn't planned it. He was in the produce section, selecting tomatoes, when he heard her distinctive voice. "Elijah?" He turned slowly. Gloria stood there in her Thursday tennis outfit, a shopping basket hooked over her arm. Her usual aristocratic poise seemed slightly strained. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice pitched low. "Like family?" Elijah said nothing, but he didn't walk away. Gloria took this as permission. "This situation," she began, gesturing vaguely with one manicured hand, "it's getting out of hand. You're tearing apart a family. My child—" "Your child made her choices," Elijah said quietly. "She was protecting herself." Gloria's voice took on a familiar note of condescension. "Surely you can understand that. After all these years, after everything this family has given you." Elijah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Given me? You've had a good life with Renee," Gloria pressed on. "A beautiful home, social connections, opportunities you might never have." "That I earned," Elijah interrupted, his voice still quiet, but carrying an edge that made Gloria step back slightly. "Every dollar, every connection, every opportunity. Then why can't you be grateful for those years and let this go?" Gloria's voice turned pleading. "Think about what you're doing to this family. To me. I'm practically your mother." Elijah looked at her for a long moment, seeing clearly the woman who had spent 12 years treating him like an unfortunate necessity in her daughter's life, who had signed property transfer documents without hesitation, who stood here now, trying to make him feel guilty for exposing fraud. "I am thinking about family," he said finally, his voice level. "I'm thinking about mine." He replaced his shopping cart carefully by the store entrance and walked out, leaving Gloria standing among the tomatoes. The next morning, Calvin arrived at Diane's office with a fresh stack of financial records. His expression suggested he'd been up most of the night. "We found the payments," he said without preamble, spreading documents across Diane's desk. "Regular monthly transfers from Renee's business account to Gloria Beaumont. 3 years' worth." Elijah leaned forward. The numbers were clear. $1,890 every month, coded as consulting fees. $68,000 total, Calvin said quietly. "We've checked every business record. There's no evidence Gloria ever provided any consulting services. No contracts, no work product, nothing." "Money from the marital asset pool," Diane observed, "being systematically transferred to her mother under false pretenses." The documents told their own story. Mother and daughter, working together to drain resources from a marriage one of them was already planning to end. Every transfer, every fake consulting fee, every dollar moved quietly from joint assets to Gloria's personal account. It formed a pattern too clear to deny. Elijah studied the numbers without speaking. He thought about Sunday dinners at Gloria's house, where she had sat at the head of the table accepting these payments while smiling at him across her perfect place settings. The magnitude of the deception was still unfolding, page by careful page. The call from Renee's attorney came late Wednesday afternoon. Diane took it in her office while Elijah sat across from her desk, watching her expression remain perfectly neutral as she listened. "I see," she said after a long moment. "And this offer has been authorized by your client?" She made a few notes on her legal pad. "I'll discuss it with mine and get back to you." She set the phone down carefully and looked at Elijah. "They're ready to deal," she said. "Renee will voluntarily disclose all accounts, transfer the commercial property back from Gloria's name, and offer you 60% of documented assets." She paused. "In exchange, they want us to drop the unjust enrichment claim and withdraw the motion naming Gloria as a party." Elijah sat perfectly still, the way he had that first day when he found the divorce petition. His expression didn't change. "They're scared," Diane continued, neither encouraging nor discouraging the offer. "The unjust enrichment claim alone could cost Renee significant equity in her firm. And Gloria's exposure on both the property transfer and those consulting fees is substantial." She spread her hands on the desk. "It's not a bad offer, mathematically. 60% of disclosed assets is higher than standard division. They're trying to contain the damage." Elijah looked at the legal pad where she'd written the terms. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but absolute. "No." Diane waited, giving him space to elaborate. "I don't want a private resolution she can reshape later," he said. "I want it in the court record. Every detail, every document, every dollar she moved, every lie she told." He met Diane's eyes. 12 years she's been writing the story of our marriage, telling people who I am, what I deserve, what she gave me. He shook his head once. "I want the truth somewhere she can't revise it. Somewhere permanent." Diane studied him for a moment, then nodded. A small smile touched the corner of her mouth. "You're going to have a very good week," she said. That evening, Elijah was sitting at his kitchen table in his small apartment, eating a simple dinner of grilled chicken and vegetables. The space was clean, minimal. He hadn't brought much from the house when he moved out after the first hearing. He didn't need much. His phone lit up with an incoming call. Renee's name appeared on the screen. It was the first time she'd called him directly since serving the divorce papers. He looked at her name for 3 rings before answering. "Hello? Elijah?" Her voice sounded different, less controlled than he was used to. I hope it's okay that I'm calling." He said nothing, just waited. "I talked to my attorney today," she continued, "about the offer. About everything." She paused. I know I made mistakes. I was scared about the business, about losing everything I'd worked for. The familiar note of self-justification crept into her voice, then faded. She seemed to be waiting for him to speak. He didn't. I never meant for it to get this complicated, she said. The property transfer, the accounts. I was just trying to protect myself. You have to understand. Her voice trailed off. The precision she'd always maintained, the careful control of every conversation, was absent now. In its place was something that almost sounded like uncertainty. We could still fix this, she said finally. Find a way to settle things quietly. For both our sakes. For the family's sake. Another pause. I did care about you, Elijah. I still do. He listened to her breathing on the other end of the line, not interrupting, not helping her find the words she was searching for, just listening to the sound of a woman who had never imagined he could be the architect of consequences. When she ran out of words, when the silence had stretched long enough to be uncomfortable, he spoke. I'll see you Thursday. He ended the call before she could respond, set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. Then he returned to his dinner, cutting each piece of chicken with the same deliberate care he'd shown all these months. Unhurried, methodical, every bite taken in the quiet of a man who knew exactly what he was building. The morning air was crisp as Elijah walked up the courthouse steps beside Diane. Her heels clicked against the stone with precise, unhurried rhythm. Neither of them spoke. They hadn't needed many words these past months. Their partnership was built on shared understanding of what precision could accomplish. Inside, Calvin and Aunt Dorothy were already seated in the gallery. Calvin gave a slight nod, his usual contained acknowledgement. Aunt Dorothy's eyes held steady warmth as Elijah took his place at the table beside Diane. The door opened again. Renee entered with her attorney, and Elijah noted the subtle signs of strain in her appearance. The slightly crooked collar of her blouse, the way her fingers kept adjusting her watch band. Small tells that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 12 years learning her habits of composure. Gloria Beaumont sat in the row behind them, beside a severe-looking woman in a charcoal suit, her newly retained counsel. Gloria's usual imperious expression was notably absent, replaced by something tighter, more uncertain. The bailiff called them to order as Judge Matthews entered. She was a woman in her early 60s who carried herself with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen every variation of human deception pass through her courtroom. She arranged her papers deliberately, then looked up at the assembled parties. Before we proceed, she began, her voice clear and measured, I want to note that I have reviewed all submitted documentation thoroughly. This includes the forensic accounting reports, property records, business filings, and relevant correspondence. She paused. The findings I'm about to deliver are based on careful consideration of the complete record. Elijah felt Renee shift slightly in her chair at the adjacent table. Her attorney had stopped writing. First, regarding the commercial property transfer to Gloria Beaumont, Judge Matthews continued. The court finds this transfer, executed for nominal consideration of $1, constitutes fraudulent conveyance under state law. The transfer is hereby voided. The property will be returned to the marital estate for equitable division. Gloria's attorney began writing rapidly. Second, regarding the undisclosed accounts identified in the forensic report, the court orders full disclosure and division of all assets contained therein, with particular attention to the documented withdrawals totaling $40,000 over the past 3 years. The judge lifted another document. Third, and significantly, we address the unjust enrichment claim regarding Mrs. Warwick's business development. She looked directly at Renee. Based on extensive documentation of Mr. Warwick's professional contributions, specifically his role in securing and maintaining the client relationships that formed the foundation of the firm's current success, the court grants his claim for equitable compensation. She named a figure that made even Diane's eyebrows lift slightly. This amount represents his documented share of the business equity, separate from standard marital asset division. Additionally, given the nature of the financial concealment evidenced in this case, Mrs. Warwick will be responsible for Mr. Warwick's full legal fees. Renee's hands were flat on the table now, perfectly still. Her attorney had stopped taking notes entirely. "Finally," Judge Matthews said, "regarding the matter of payments to Gloria Beaumont coded as consulting fees, this court is referring documentation of these transfers to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential tax law violations." Gloria's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet courtroom. "Mrs. Warwick retains ownership of her business," the judge concluded, "subject to the equity division ordered today. However, I am directing quarterly financial monitoring for the next 24 months to ensure compliance with all court orders." She looked between the parties. "These findings are final. This matter is concluded." The sharp crack of her gavel seemed to break whatever tension had held the room still. Chairs scraped. Papers shuffled. Voices began to murmur. Outside, the morning had warmed. Elijah stood with Diane on the courthouse steps while she reviewed the final order. Calvin and Aunt Dorothy waited nearby, giving him space to process the moment. 20 feet away, Renee stood alone, her designer handbag clutched tight against her side. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of consequences she'd never calculated. Gloria hurried toward her, but for this moment she was utterly isolated, stripped of every layer of control she'd built so carefully. She looked across the distance at Elijah. There was no whisper now, no performance, nothing left to manipulate or conceal. Just the bare reality of a woman facing the architecture of her own choices. Elijah met her gaze once, taking in the full measure of this ending. Then he turned to join Diane, Calvin, and Aunt Dorothy walking toward the parking lot. He did not look back. Monday morning arrived with familiar rhythm. Elijah's desk held the same stack of structural plans. His inbox contained the same steady flow of project updates, and his coffee tasted exactly as it had for years. But something had shifted, not in the objects around him, but in how people moved through his space. Mark Chen, a senior partner, lingered after the morning briefing. "Heard the proceedings wrapped up," he said carefully. "Hope you're doing all right." Elijah nodded, appreciating the understated concern. "I am." No further words were needed. In their profession, precision spoke louder than sentiment. Mark simply clapped him once on the shoulder and headed to his next meeting. By Wednesday, the court findings had filtered through professional channels. Sandra from accounting stopped by his office with a question about a project budget, then paused at the door. "That commercial property on Highland, the one your wife's firm was running their business out of, is that the same one that just got flagged for title review?" "It is," Elijah said evenly. Sandra's expression shifted. She'd handled the firm's billing for that project. She'd seen whose relationships had actually secured that contract. She nodded once and left, but Elijah knew the quiet confirmation would travel. Truth had its own momentum once released. No announcements required. The following week, the regional business magazine that had featured Renee's profile received an email from a reader, someone in commercial development who knew both parties professionally. The message was simple: a question about the origin story of Renee's relationship with Midwest Development Group, her cornerstone client. The magazine's fact-checker, doing due diligence, reached out directly to James Harrison, Midwest's CEO. James had known Elijah for 11 years, since they'd worked together on a major downtown project. He'd always respected how Elijah operated. No games, no politics, just solid work and kept promises. "I need to correct the record," James told the fact-checker. "My relationship with Warwick Design began through Elijah Warwick. He'd handled structural engineering on 3 of our major projects. When his wife mentioned she was building an interior design firm, I agreed to consider her for our new corporate headquarters because I trusted his judgment. That's the actual history." The magazine ran a correction in their next issue. 3 paragraphs, no editorial commentary. Just facts. The client relationship originated through Elijah Warwick's professional history with Midwest Development Group, contrary to what was stated in the profile. Small, factual, permanent. The correction circulated among Renee's professional circles. 2 weeks later, Davidson Properties, a client who'd signed with her firm based largely on the Midwest Development portfolio, quietly took their business elsewhere. By the end of the quarter, Meridian Group had followed. People who worked with Renee now knew what the court had found. Some of them reassessed. Business decisions were rarely personal, but they were always practical. Gloria Beaumont's mail that Thursday included a certified letter from the state attorney general's office. The language was precise and unambiguous. They requested documentation relating to consulting payments received from Warwick Design LLC between 2019 and 2022, including contracts, work product, and tax filings. She called 3 tax attorneys before finding one who could see her immediately. The $68,000 she'd accepted without question, money that had funded vacations, home renovations, and a new car, was now a problem with her name on it. Renee's high-priced divorce attorney declined to handle the follow-on proceedings at his usual rate. His office sent a polite letter explaining their new fee structure for continuing representation. She couldn't afford it. Not with the business-bleeding clients. Not with the court-ordered equity payment to Elijah. Not with the quarterly monitoring eating up billable hours. Meanwhile, Elijah's professional world expanded. The way he'd handled an extraordinarily difficult year, maintaining every deadline, delivering every project, never letting personal chaos bleed into professional obligations, had not gone unnoticed. Friday afternoon, Mark Chen and the other senior partners called him into the conference room. The conversation was brief and direct. They'd been considering him for senior partnership for months, but his performance this year had accelerated their timeline. "We value people who can handle pressure without losing precision," Mark said simply. "The position is yours, if you want it." Elijah looked at the offer letter. The terms were clear, the expectations well-defined, no hidden clauses, no concealed intentions, just straightforward recognition of proven capability. "Yes," he said, "I accept." The New Orleans morning air carried hints of chicory and beignets from Café du Monde. Elijah sat at an outdoor table with Calvin and their college friends, Marcus and David, watching tourists and locals mix on Decatur Street. The weekend had started Thursday night, and none of them had checked work email since arriving. "Man, when's the last time we did this?" Marcus asked, brushing powdered sugar from his shirt. "Too long," Calvin said. "We're getting old waiting for these reunions." Elijah smiled, genuinely relaxed for the first time in what felt like years. The weight he'd carried for so long, through the discovery, through 8 months of gathering evidence, through the proceedings, had finally lifted. His laugh came easier now, unshadowed by performance or pretense. "Speaking of old," David said, "remember that dump we shared junior year? 4 of us in 2 bedrooms? With the leaking ceiling," Calvin added, and Elijah trying to explain to the landlord about load-bearing walls. "Man was charging full rent for a death trap," Elijah said. "Some things you can't fix without starting over." They spent the morning wandering the French Quarter, stopping at antique shops and art galleries. No schedule, no agenda. Just 4 friends who'd known each other since they were broke college kids with big dreams, now successful men who'd earned every step of their progress. Later, over lunch at a small Creole place off Bourbon Street, Calvin studied Elijah's face. "You look good, brother. Better than I've seen in years." Elijah nodded. His new apartment across town was everything he needed. Clean lines, quiet spaces, and a dedicated office where he could think without interference. The furniture was minimal but chosen with care. No clutter, no excess, just room to breathe. He'd started dating again, casually. Coffee meetings and dinner conversations with women who intrigued him. Nothing serious yet, But he was genuinely open to possibility in a way that surprised him. He'd forgotten how it felt to simply enjoy someone's company without calculating their intentions. Every Sunday, like clockwork, he called Aunt Dorothy. Their conversations had evolved from the intensity of the divorce period to something lighter but no less meaningful. She asked about his cases, his project, the new partnership responsibilities. She listened to the spaces between his words. "Are you happy?" she'd asked last weekend. "I'm getting there," he'd answered honestly. "That's more truth than most people manage," she'd said. "Some folks spend their whole lives pretending they arrived." Thoughts of Renee still surfaced occasionally, but without the sharp edges of before. He examined those memories the way he'd examine any failed structure, with professional distance, looking for the points where the foundation had been compromised. There was no hatred left, no active anger, just clinical understanding of how thoroughly she'd underestimated him and how that miscalculation had ultimately collapsed everything she'd tried to build. The record existed now, permanent and unalterable. The court documents, the magazine correction, the professional consequences. She would never fully understand what she'd destroyed. Not just the marriage, but the possibility of ever being trusted the same way again. He'd made peace with her inability to recognize that loss. After lunch, while Marcus and David headed back to the hotel for a nap, Elijah stood on the restaurant's second-floor balcony. Calvin joined him briefly, then went to settle the bill. New Orleans moved below him, musicians setting up for evening sets, restaurant workers changing shifts, couples walking hand in hand through the afternoon light. He held his coffee cup, still half full, and thought about the buildings around him. Some dated back centuries, still standing because their foundations had been laid with honesty and care. Others were newer, but already showing stress cracks from hidden compromises in their construction. As an engineer, he read these stories in every facade. The same principles applied to everything he built: relationships, career, reputation. The foundation determined what would last. Integrity wasn't just a moral choice, it was a structural necessity. The coffee had cooled. The afternoon crowd was thickening on the street below. He could hear Marcus and David returning, their voices carrying up from the sidewalk. Calvin was probably wondering where he'd disappeared to. Elijah took a final sip from his cup. Time to go back inside. Several weeks after returning from New Orleans, Elijah was reviewing structural calculations in his office when his phone buzzed. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Elijah Warwick speaking. "Mr. Warwick, this is Sarah Chen from Metropolitan Business Quarterly, the same magazine that had run the correction on Renee's profile. We're doing a feature on the architects of our city's recent development boom, the people behind the structures reshaping our skyline. Your name keeps coming up in our research." Elijah sat back in his chair. "What kind of feature?" "A profile piece. We'd like to focus on your engineering work, particularly your approach to sustainable urban development. Would you be open to an interview?" He considered it briefly. "Yes, I would." They arranged to meet at his newest project site, a mixed-use development incorporating advanced earthquake-resistant systems. Sarah arrived promptly at 9, notebook in hand, accompanied by a photographer. The site hummed with morning activity. Workers called out coordinates. Cranes swung overhead. Elijah led them through the skeleton of what would become the building's core, explaining load distribution and foundation principles in clear, accessible terms. "The challenge isn't just making something stand," he said, gesturing to the massive support columns. "It's making something that stands gracefully, that serves its purpose while respecting its environment. Every decision we make at the foundation level affects what's possible later." Sarah noted how the workers greeted him, not with the forced deference shown to visiting executives, but with the easy respect given to someone who understood their craft. He knew their names. He asked about specific challenges they'd discussed in previous visits. You grew up in Memphis, Sarah said as they reached a vantage point overlooking the city. What brought you here? Opportunity, Elijah answered. Memphis taught me about building something from nothing, about patience, about understanding that the most important work often happens below ground, where nobody sees it. The photographer captured him in his element, hard hat in hand, construction site behind him, city skyline stretching to the horizon. His expression was focused but relaxed, the face of a man completely in command of his expertise. What's your philosophy on legacy? Sarah asked. These buildings will be standing long after we're gone. Elijah considered this. Integrity embedded in a foundation never needs to announce itself. It simply holds. Everything I build, structures, relationships, reputation, follows that principle. The truth of your work speaks through its endurance. The interview continued for another hour. He spoke about technical innovations, about mentoring young engineers, about his vision for responsible urban development. Not once did he mention Renee or the divorce. He didn't need to. His accomplishments stood independently of that chapter. The morning the article published, Calvin texted him a link. City Builder, the engineer behind our changing skyline. The photograph was striking. Elijah looked directly at the camera, professional and assured, with his life's work rising behind him. His phone began filling with messages, colleagues sharing the article, former clients expressing appreciation, current partners noting how perfectly the piece captured his approach to their shared project. Aunt Dorothy called that afternoon, laughing with pride. Now, that's what I call making something last, she said. You built all that while carrying what you were carrying. That's who you are. Just doing the work, he replied. The work speaks, she said. And people are finally listening properly. That evening, Elijah sat in his home office. The city lights glimmered outside his window, some of them illuminating buildings he'd helped create. He picked up his phone and opened the Notes application, scrolling back through old entries. There it was, dated more than 2 years ago. What she thinks, I don't know. He looked at it for a moment, remembering the night he started that list. The quiet fury, the methodical documentation, the long patience. Without opening it, he deleted the note. He set his phone down on his desk. Tomorrow would bring new calculations, new challenges, new structures reaching toward the sky. The work continued. It always did. His legacy wasn't in what he'd survived. It was in what he'd built while surviving it. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.